Hi there. In this lecture, let's talk about the way people have talked about African art and Africa. And of course, this is a history largely from the perspective of Europe and the United States, people who have had a vested interest in describing, or cataloging, or using African art to their own ends. And we'll talk a little bit about, the ways in which perceptions of Africa have changed over the years. To begin with, Europe was always sort of fascinated in the African continent because it was so very impenetrable. It was very close geographically relative to other parts of the world, and yet it was one of the last continents to be fully explored. Again, as we described in the period on geography, the interior of Africa was very difficult to navigate because of the lack of rivers that flowed into the interior all the way, and ways in which people could traverse the dangerous jungles and savannas, and with all the tropical diseases and everything else that was there, making the continent so inhospitable. This 1844 map shows us some of the fantasies and ideas that were prevalent at the time in Africa. The geography is only suggestive. There's no clear knowledge of actual rivers and mountains and how they worked. And there's even indication of a kingdom of Prester John, who was a Christian nation trapped in the heathen, pagan interior of Africa. And this was an idea that was used to convince kings and other nobles to support the exploration of Africa. It was to say that there was these Christian people trapped in the interior, and it was sort of like a crusade to go and find and help them as a fellow Christian nation. Portuguese were the first to sort of navigate the exterior of Africa and make some inroads into the interior of Africa. They felt it was their mission to convert the people of Africa to Christianity, and they set up several missions. Most of those would fail by the 17th century as they were sort of overrun with disease and just the enormous distance to civilization in the West. Critical concepts about Africa began with the Enlightenment, as people were starting to understand human societies and human governments and human social organization. David Hume wrote an essay that tried to explain the relationship between human nature and the governments, and he felt that moral causes such as governments were more prominently influencing human nature than physical causes such as native food and climate. So really putting it into human societies as the primary characteristic. That said, in his revised 1753 edition of this, he made the controversial claim, unsupported by any evidence, that African societies were more primitive than European societies. Now, later on, another very important theoretical framework for understanding Africa comes from Charles Darwin. Now, Charles Darwin did not spend any time in Africa. He did not comment on African peoples, but many of his ideas on evolution were used as a means to justify the expansion of colonialism, and that the African people were less developed, less evolved, and that they were in need of Western civilization, government, and taxation. So when people say Africa is primitive, what do they mean? So the word very simply means primary in time, something first, something original. And it's true in a very literal way that Africa is home to the first original human beings, the primitive humans. That does not say that the people living there today are in any way primitive or have any characteristics that are associated with primitive. which is unsophisticated, crude, vulgar, not realistic, uneducated, intuitive, natural, lacking in history, something that has not changed or evolved. So that unlike the rest of the world, which has evolved and changed, the primitive societies of Africa are fixed in their past. And this is just not true. And you should be very careful when using this word that you mean entirely what you say, is people will who read your work, when you say this word primitive, may take you to mean other more negative connotations you may not intend. Now, similarly, words like tribe and native, while they are acceptable in the Native American context to the best that I know, I don't usually do research in Native American cultures, but in Africa, we don't speak of tribes or tribal peoples. We speak of cultures and nations. The Zulu, with 9 million people, should not be called a tribe. Native just means something that someone is born to a particular place. But if, again, you're insinuating something primitive with that term, then you are mistaken. So let's talk about some of the myths about African art, along with association with myths about the people and their development and their history. There are lots of myths about the art that comes from those people as well. One of the common ones is that in being a sort of a timeless and unchanging in its aesthetic appeal, that it has something that has been there for all time. This is the way they've made art. This is the way they've always made art. And this is what all they know how to do. And so it's not about individual artistry, because that's not important. They're just, doing what comes natural to them. That's the way it often is described, that there's no skill or training involved. It's just sort of this innate ability that they have that are due to, ignorance and incompetence. Hence, something that might look crude or less developed or not have a realistic representation or doesn't use perspective. All of these are ideas that are, negative connotations that people make because it doesn't look like European art, when in fact it is extremely sophisticated if you're willing to look at it on its own terms. Now, prior to the 19th century, there was, as we've mentioned before, a lot of imperialism, racism, and general contempt for primitive peoples. The objects that were collected were often taken without any acknowledgement of the artist who created them, or even the people who made them. They would just pick them up, or they would rob them or loot them, or they would pay them some pittance for them. And these objects were, taken back as curios and put and housed in sort of the earliest examples we have of kind of museums. It's called Wunderkammer, these cabinets of curiosities that people would collect such strange objects for conversation. And so they're not art. They were totems, fetishes with a sort of quaint, exotic appeal. And their strangeness is what made people wonder about them and found them fascinating. But they would never, for once, consider, the aesthetic terms that they were made, or the idea or the actual function or purpose of the work of art. It wasn't until the late 1860s that people began to theorize about why African art was so different from art of the West. And Gottfried Semper, who was an architect, sort of looked at a lot of African art that had been collected. He had never actually visited Africa. He wasn't really interested in what people had to say about their own art. He instead was fascinated by the visual character of the art and started to compare it to the visual character of other nations around the world. And what he sort of deduced from his observations was that the geometric nature of African art was derived from its early use of basketry, which sort of imposes a grid-like geometry on the design, and then this sort of was carried over into other parts of the tactile arts of sculpture and forms, where that even didn't impose that grid. The problem with that theory is that many different regions that don't even have basketry still use a kind of geometric grid pattern. And so this overarching theme, an idea that he had created, was really just sort of an invention of his own mind, and what didn't really directly represent the reality on hand. Then as we approach the modern world, there was a new fascination for African art. Artists like Pablo Picasso and Braque and others were looking at African art as a way of kind of breaking away from what they felt was the kind of stultifying regularity of the Western traditions. And they wanted to sort of break into a kind of new vocabulary. For them, it was a rejection of Western civilization. It was a kind of rejection of all that had come before and a kind of radical departure. It really didn't have any interest in what Africa was or what Africa represented in reality. They never went to Africa. They never studied African art except to look at it visually and glean from it what information was most beneficial to them. So in this case here, people like Picasso were deciding what African art was. And we can see that in his own description of his first encounter with African art, which he described many years later. He said he went to the Trocadero. Trocadero was a museum of kind of curios. It was more like a flea market. And the smell, I was alone. I wanted to get away, but I didn't leave. I stayed. They were magic things. The Negro pieces were intercessors, mediators. I understood what the Negroes used their sculptures for. Why sculpt like that and not some other way? So for him, he sort of intuits this idea of frightening magical objects that are used to sort of terrify us away from our complacency. And it wasn't get to him a way to sort of deal with his own angers and animosities toward Western civilization and a kind of radical rejection of the characteristics of classic art. These, again, it's the European who is determining what is African art. And it not really based on actual research. And it sort of overlays African art with this idea of the terrifying, the primitive, and the savage. Franz Boas was an American who trained in Chicago and was one of the first archaeologists, anthropologists to really go into the field and begin to talk to people and study their ways and try to understand their work. And he was very influential in defining the field of anthropology, and he brought to it a new kind of critical understanding where he rejected a lot of what had come before. And here he writes in his book, Primitive Art, using the word primitive, but then immediately qualifying what he means basically just primary in time. And he says, anyone who has lived with primitive tribes, who has shared their joys and sorrows, their privations, and their luxuries, who sees in them not solely objects of study to be examined like a cell under a microscope, but feeling and thinking human beings, will agree that there is no such thing as a primitive mind, a magical or pre-logical way of thinking, but each individual in primitive society is a man, woman, and child of the same kind, the same way of thinking, feeling, and acting as a man, woman, and child in our own society. Likewise, he says, it has often been observed that cultural traits are exceedingly tenacious and that features of hoary antiquity survive until the present day. This has led to the impression that primitive culture is almost stable and has remained what it is for many centuries. This does not correspond to the facts. Wherever we have detailed information, we have found of forms of objects and customs in constant flux. So this is really important. He not only debunks the idea that these people are somehow different than us as human beings. He says they're fully human, just as we are fully human. He goes on to say that what we see in the art is not fixed in time, but is ever evolving and changing according to these people's needs, interests, and desires. His conclusions about primitive art could not exist until the artist had sufficient skill required to master the material, right? So art is not about perception or thinking, it's about mastery of the material. And he says there are no universal meanings in art. The same form can mean different things to different people. And this has been proven out time and time again. So don't assume that just because you understand what something means to one culture, you can overlay that automatically onto another culture from another place at another time. So this leads us to a question. Was there ever a time in human history when art was primitive? How did it begin? And surprisingly, we don't really have an answer for that because the most ancient art we have is surprisingly sophisticated, remarkably complex, beautifully composed and created. So what can we say about human nature and art? It doesn't evolve. And within any given period of art, there is surprisingly and amazingly sophisticated use of techniques available at the time. At any particular time, the practitioners are usually as good as their techniques will allow them to be. So here's some questions for you to check your comprehension on this lecture. How did early perceptions of the people of Africa impact the way people thought about art they made? How did modern art ideas of African art distort the way people saw African art? How is Boaz different from Semper in their theories of culture and art? How does culture impact perception? Lastly, how are emic and eidetic ways of describing art useful? Now, these last two questions, they really do belong to our next lecture when I'll talk about emic and eidetic ways of describing useful art. They're just sort of tacked on here by accident.